Hey everyone, it's your host Ian Garcia. Just a heads up for this episode. It's a new season here at Monster Craze Memoirs, and a new season means a new setup, new equipment, and new ways of trying to make Rocco speak into the microphone so that we can get a crisper recording of him. There was a lot of research that went into this first episode, and it was actually originally going to cover both Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein, but ultimately I had a lot of stuff going around in my head that I wanted to cover for both films, and we just ran way too long, so I'm splitting it up into two episodes, one coming this weekend, the other coming out next weekend. And if you're subscribed to us on Patreon or Apple Podcasts or on the platform of your choosing, you'll see that I've given you some supplemental materials to fill in the gaps of what we don't cover in this episode. Please forgive me if things are a little rough and abrupt here, but for what it's worth, I think we still got some really good stuff coming down the pipeline. So, without further ado, let's start the show.
To die, to be really dead, that must be glorious.
Why, Count Dracula.
There are far worse things waiting man than death.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome to the second season of Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me as always is my father, Rocco.
Hello and welcome to all.
So we're getting back into the second season of this program, and we decided that what we would do is we would kind of try to go back to the early beginnings of American horror and science fiction. And I suppose in order to do that, we kind of had to go back to the studio that kind of originated the genre. Obviously, from a historical perspective, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. One is that, horror as a concept had obviously existed in some form in literature, and as well as in theater and in cinema, even long before the sound film era. You can think of silent film classics such as Nosferatu, or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or The Golem. Basically, a lot of German films are kind of overrepresentative of what we would consider prototypical horror. But you can also even consider the short, magical films of Georges Méliès or Segundo de Chamon, the Spanish filmmaker. These sort of early silent film magicians who would use the early editing techniques in order to create magic tricks, and therefore they could use to make stories just as often about haunted houses or adaptations of literature, such as most famously Georges Méliès adapted Jules Verne's A Trip to the Moon. But I think the other way of looking at it from a historical perspective is the one in which we take horror as a coherent genre, as one that really emerges in Hollywood in the early Great Depression, in the late 20s and the early 30s. And sort of the reasoning behind viewing it that way is, first of all, as far as, the films of Georges Méliès or Segundo de Chamon, the emphasis on those sorts of movies was really more light humor and fantasy rather than the objective to scare or to disturb or shock the viewer. Whereas the German expressionist films that we can think of, again, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Haxan, A History of Witchcraft, those films, obviously, they were tremendously influential upon horror, and we could even go back and say that they are, sort of prototypical horror films. But really, when we consider them in the broader German expressionist movement, it's impossible to talk about them without talking about them in the context of that artistic movement and the attendant themes that weren't unique to horror, really. You see similar themes in the crime thriller and spy films and science fiction, all of these different genres all found ways to be expressed in German Expressionism with this unique focus on subjectivity and psychology as a way of portraying something as opposed to a realistic method. And so when it comes to the American Hollywood horror film, I think the issue is primarily that, with the exception of the sort of European art film, there really wasn't a tradition of horror film as a genre before the 1930s. What you do have is sort of prototypical movies, movies that may feature, particularly ghoulish subjects, or films that may take place in old dark houses, or feature as the enemies sort of megalomaniacal villains, or mad doctors, or, in the case of, say, London After Midnight, or The Cat and the Canary, or even The Unknown. What you have is, in terms of the thing is that the whole philosophy of those films and the whole cultural orientation of them is one where really, like, if you're thinking of something like The Cat and the Canary and the London After Midnight, The Phantom of the Opera, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the explanation for horror, or the way horror is expressed, is always in very corporeal and human terms. Even when there are elements of the supernatural or the occult in these movies, particularly in the case of London After Midnight with vampires, or The Cat and the Canary with the haunted house, the explanation is always that the horrific elements are just things that are used by the villains of the films as a way to dupe people or to get away with their crimes. Or the alternative is that there are some prototypical horror films in which the supernatural things that are experienced by the characters are really just expressions of their guilt at having done something wrong, which is all just to say that before the 1930s, you really didn't have a coherent genre anywhere in the world, with the exception of maybe Germany, where there was a place where the supernatural itself was taken at face value, where a film in which references to the occult and to vampires or adaptations of horror literature were not done in a style where at the end of the movie everything is sort of restored to order. You are returned to a place where there are no vampires, there are no ghosts, there are no haunted houses. Everything is sort of organized around people, good and bad people, and law coming in to correct for the, criminal elements and such like that. And even if you think about it from the German expressionist angle, these are films that only really manifest with the unique emphasis on a psychological or a surreal aesthetic that is specifically not trying to go for a realistic portrayal of them. Like, it's something like Nosferatu. There's no attempt to situate the vampire within the realm of material reality or some kind of psychologically realistic everyday view of the world where we could, it's very particular to a way of expressing some primordial fear or superstition or a paranoia.
Would you say that something like the It series, would go in that kind of genre, sort of like it's not really tied to humans. They have their frailties, but the actual evil is intrinsically evil in itself, and it's its own entity.
I think it's a combination of the way horror emerges as a cinematic genre, and really the way in which horror is even conceived of as a genre, right, is the disaggregation of the element of horror from just first, number one, that it's something that is not portrayed as false or as spurious. It's not something that has a logical explanation from the point of view of a secular, rational world. In horror fiction and in horror cinema, at least at its foundation, horror is something that exists It is there, and it is really, in fact, the only way that order is restored by the heroes of the films is to recognize and to deal with the fact that the supernatural exists. And the other element of it is that far more than just the narrative element where the supernatural exists, there's also the aesthetic element, where rather than these movies being particular to a specific national artistic movement, such as German Expressionism, what you have in Hollywood is the incorporation of the supernatural into a formalized technical process of establishing psychological realism, of suturing the spectator into a form of spectatorship where they are specifically not distracted by aesthetics, where they are not distanced from it at an intellectual level, where they are totally immersed psychologically in the seamless presentation of the world as something that is internally coherent and that is in some sense reflective of what they understand as possible within reality. And so with something like It, obviously It is written in the...
Yeah, I made a mistake. It actually came from space in a second. So really it's not intrinsic in itself of being an evil that exists in the world parallel with what we think is reality. Whereas it actually, they give it a reason, which really detracts from the movie. Because it's
Wait, are you
better.
talking about Stephen King's It or
Yes.
It, the Terror from Beyond Space?
No, Stephen King's It. I'm sorry. Yes, I meant that kind of.
Well, it's like, but obviously, obviously It is really far off in terms of what we're talking about, but it is definitely, it's, and that's the thing is that, like, it is a book and a TV miniseries and a film adaptation that is made in a context where horror is now a coherent, understood genre rather than something that is merely packaged and thrown in with other types of weird fiction, adventure, fantasy, science fiction. Back really, and I tried to do as much research as I could to find out when and where people first started using the term horror fiction. And really what I found was, outside of authors themselves, horror story or horror fiction was not really generally used in the popular lexicon before the 20s. So what you have is, even when we're looking at prototypical works of horror, whether it's the Phantom of the Opera or the Hunchback of Notre Dame, what you're looking at are movies that have elements of the horrific, that have elements of the unusual and the disturbing, but are more or less incorporated into their own pre-existing genre. So the Phantom of the Opera and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, they're romances and historical epics first, and the horrific plays a particular role in terms of expressing a certain theme, whether it's a theme of revenge or betrayal or alienation or the outsider. Or you have something like The Cat and the Canary or London After Midnight. Really, these are mystery thrillers. They're mystery stories. They're detective stories. They're a part of their own genre where the horrific is expressed, but the horrific is not constitutive of the entire framework of the narrative itself. So I think what it is that the reason that it's kind of helpful to look at horror as originating in the early sound era, in the early 30s, is because it's really here for the first time that you see filmmakers specifically trying to make in film form what had already been existent in literature since the late 19th century. And even then, from the late 19th century up to the early 20th century, these were not, even these ghost stories or these stories of the terrifying or the horrifying, they themselves were part of their own sort of literary traditions, whether it's the Romantic tradition or the Gothic tradition. So basically what I'm saying is that the reason we go to the 30s is that it is, despite the fact that you can look past those points, even further into the past and see prototypical elements of horror, it is really in this period, the late 20s and the early 30s, that we start to see the coherent, self-conscious understanding of horror as its own unique genre. And then, of course, the filmmakers themselves coming to it and saying, well, what are the rules of horror? What are the expectations of horror? What is a horror film? Because really, when we're talking about the earliest horror films in America, these were really things that no one had done before. No one had really made a movie, with very rare exceptions, in which the supernatural was real and the supernatural was taken seriously, or where sensational science was taken seriously, where it wasn't comic farce, it wasn't just a ruse put on by a bad guy. So that's where we're at in the early 30s, where, and obviously all of these things come back to Universal Pictures. Universal Pictures is basically the studio that, we commonly associate Universal Studios and Universal Pictures with the first kind of cycle of film horror, whether we're and also with just a kind of house of horrors, with the classic roster of monsters, whether it's Dracula, whether it's Frankenstein's monster, or the Wolfman, or the Mummy, or the creature from the Black Lagoon. But even that is kind of overly simplistic to the extent, well, it doesn't really get to the heart of it, which is that Universal basically in the early 30s more or less invents the horror genre. They are the first ones out of the gate that are centering the horrific and making this the primary way in which the primary mechanism of appealing to the spectator and creating this new genre that then sort of slowly snowballs and develops and spreads to other studios and to other countries.
I want to say, what about Freddy Krueger? Is that a type of thing where it's horror in its own, like it's a real horror, but it has the same kind of synthesis, sort of, even though it's more modern day, in terms of the evil being not a tangible, not a realistic type of thing, but it manifests itself like in dreams and things like that. I think there are other ways that we've learned from these earlier pictures how to go from horror in its own right. But, the reason I'm saying this, you always have someone around that actually believes in this stuff in the movies. So there's always a Van Helsing. There's always some doctor that talks about, oh yeah, that we know all about vampires, and then other people are saying, oh, it's science fiction. You're talking fantasy. So I'm wondering if that's, something that needs to be mentioned, that you still, even within these pictures, a realistic element is implied by having people like that as your interlocutors between the unbelieving world and the actual creatures.
Well, I think that gets to an important point where it's like, again, from the origin of the horror film, we have this, again, we start to see the foundation of this narrative formula, where at least in cases where the supernatural is there and center, you have the fact that the supernatural is there, but the secular, rational, modern world is not even prepared to accept it. So there always has to be some person, either an individual or a group of people, who are personally confronted with it and then are in the position of having to convince and persuade others of the seriousness of a problem and the necessity of dealing with it through non-rational means.
Gentlemen, we are dealing with the undead.
Nosferatu.
Yes, Nosferatu. The undead. The vampire.
But, Professor Van Helsing, modern medical science does not admit of such a creature. The vampire's a pure myth, superstition.
I may be able to bring you proof that the superstition of yesterday can become the scientific reality of today.
So basically, we had to, I think the reason that it's important to go back to Universal, especially if we're, in a podcast about B movies, is that Universal really does sort of found the horror movie and slowly build on most of its narrative formulas and even sort of create all of the prototypical monsters that would then be reused and recycled throughout decades. And so really it only seemed logical for the opening of this second season to go all the way back to the 30s, to begin at Universal in 1930, 1931, under the stewardship of Carl Laemmle Jr. I've said his name wrongly in the past. I've said it Carl Laemmle Jr. instead of Carl Laemmle Jr. But, under the presidency of Carl Laemmle Jr., who was very much a fan of the prestige pictures that Universal had made in the early past, particularly one starring Lon Chaney, The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and who, despite what his father, the company founder Carl Laemmle, said, and despite everybody else around him saying that there's no way to capitalize upon this, people won't take it seriously, or the censors will never let you get away with some of this stuff, he was adamant that a film in which you just portray the supernatural or the weird and don't discredit it, that, that you could really make a lot of money, that there was this entire market that was being untapped. And so the first film that kind of comes out of that situation is obviously Dracula, which really we can kind of say basically is the first modern horror film. Obviously adapted from Bram Stoker's novel, the story of a Transylvanian undead vampire that travels to England in order to prey upon the blood of women. And then, of course, the only person who is able to see it and understand it is, of course, Van Helsing, the doctor who, despite his scientific credentials and being very well respected, is also respectful of the supernatural and of the old world, and realizes that in order to face the new dilemma of the vampire, you have to take it seriously. You have to go back and you have to begin with the question that these old superstitions begin with a kernel of truth. I have to admit, I don't think I'm very fond of Dracula. It's a very rough movie. It's one of those things where it is the first horror movie, so to speak. And as a result of that, all of the rules being unwritten, all of this being new territory, its roughness is kind of an expression of the fact that the people who were making it, nobody had ever made something like this. No one had ever tried to make a horror movie. So everyone is so you see the sort of experimentation going on of what you can do, of how do you structure the story this way.
I think, again, it's when you look at the perspective of a younger person, your expectation is seeing a lot more of the horror aspect for the thrill of it. When you get older, you appreciate it for its play sensibilities, and the dialogue. You pay attention to the characters, you pay attention to the dialogue. And I thought it was a very interesting film. I thought I had a lot of fun watching it. And I thought it was a good film. You're right. I think the pacing's a little slow. But I think overall, and I like the fact that there's no distracting music to enhance the, I call it distraction, but of course the music has its purposes. But seeing it as a play unfold, I thought it was it was like I'm sitting in a theater watching someone put on a play about Dracula. The sets are more marvelous sets, as you've informed me. Giant sets. I thought they were painted backgrounds and things like that, and they weren't. I mean, some of them were obviously for the stagecoach eventually going into the distance, going to the castle.
So you've kind of hit on three important points there. One of that being the sort of the sets of the film, which is basically gets into the budget of it. And so even though this is a podcast about B movies, it really must be said that Dracula and Frankenstein are not B movies.
They're not B movies, yes.
They were $100,000 prestige pictures made by one of the smaller major studios, but nonetheless a major Hollywood studio, the one that had at the time had the biggest studio lot on 230 acres of sets and open space in which they regularly shot movies. And for the most part, Universal at this time, since its inception, for the most of the part, they did only shoot low-budget programmers, particularly westerns and short comedies and musicals. But it was, and while there had been prestige pictures occasionally, it was really Carl Laemmle Jr. who wanted to do more prestige movies because he felt that it was critical to modernize the company, to boost its profile, to try new things. And so, so that's the thing to focus on, is that, Dracula is a budget picture. It has huge sweeping sets. It has a cast of actors who would be recognizable back in those days, if not on the screen, then from Broadway. And obviously that then gets into the second point you bring up, which is the theatrical presentation of the movie. Because a big part of the reason why Dracula was even made was because of the success of a stage version of it originally written by Hamilton Dean, who was a British playwright and adapter, and then later modified by John L. Balderston for its American version, the one that was on Broadway and then toured the West Coast. It was a very, very successful play. It was also, not for nothing, two of the actors who were featured in the play actually appear in the movie. Obviously Edward Van Sloan, who plays Van Helsing in the film, played Van Helsing in the stage version. And as well, of course, Bela Lugosi, who stars in the film as Dracula, a relatively unknown actor, at least in America at the time, except for the stage play, takes on the role when it's brought to the film. And what's interesting is that the movie itself does not take that many cues from the play version. And this is something that I learned about as I was doing research for it, where it's kind of a mashup of elements of the play in terms of, because the very important thing about the play is that the play more or less just presented a way that you could condense Bram Stoker's very long and complicated book into a series of scenarios that you could then present in a slightly, a 85-ish minute movie. But the movie itself, it's sort of, most of the stuff that happens in the first half is closer to the original novel than what happens later. But that's the reason, if there's a theatrical quality to the movie, this very sort of, to the extent that, there are many scenes in the film that are done entirely in master shot, by which I mean it is just a wide shot of the set with all of the major characters in it, with very few cutaways, very few close-ups. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of theatrical quality may in fact be an attempt to play on the recognition of the very successful play version that had toured in the country about 3 years before and had continued to play to much success. And then I think you made another point about the music.
The lack of it.
Yes. And that was the thing, is that, and this is one of those things where this is the part where it's it's sort of the gray area between deliberate creative decisions and just lack of money and disorganization. Because the thing you have to understand is that Universal at this time was in really dire financial straits. Because, for the longest time, Carl Laemmle had really been against modernizing the company. He was very slow to adopt sound technology and convert to creating full sound pictures. He was a guy who did not use outside investment in order to fund his movies, and he was someone who was very risk averse. So, and in addition to that, he was also, he was also kind of notorious for his nepotism. The sort of pejorative nickname he had in Hollywood was Uncle Carl Laemmle, because of his notoriousness for taking people who were in his extended family and giving them sort of cushy, easy positions in the Universal's, sort of staff. And, the thing with Carl Laemmle Jr. is that he becomes the president of Universal as his 21st birthday present. So already Carl Laemmle Jr., he has a kind of reputation as a nepotism case. And not just a nepotism case that he, notoriously he was very hard to work with. He could be very indecisive. He was not particularly good at conveying what he wanted. He had a general idea of what he wanted the company to be and what he wanted the company to do. But when it came to actually producing films, and more importantly, producing them in a cost-effective way that made money, ultimately the end of the Laemmle's control of Universal, which would not come until 1936. But ultimately, the studio is very disorganized at the time. So in order for Carl Laemmle Jr. to modernize the company, that means investing large amounts of capital more in sound, more in prestige pictures. So when those investments don't pay off, that then creates a kind of vicious cycle at Universal where they very rarely finish out the fiscal year with a profit. And in fact, 1931 was one of the few years during the 1930s in which Universal actually did end up with a profit. And more than half of that profit is owed exclusively to the box office success of Dracula. This was the one that paid off, as it were. But as a result of that partially as a result of that studio disorganization, there was no budget to create an original film score for the movie. And so what's interesting about Dracula, well, there's two pieces of music, but both of them are classical. One is diegetic, because, it's in the scene where they're at the opera house and Dracula meets the Seward family for the first time and, sets his sights on Mina and her friend Lucy as his potential victims. He meets all the major characters. And then the opening credits of the film, it's an excerpt from the Swan Lake Suite by Tchaikovsky. Other than that, there is no musical scoring in Dracula. And so to a modern viewer, this is probably one of the most disorienting things about it, because so much of the film is ambient. So much of the film is exclusively visually oriented and just taking in, and in a lot of cases, taking in sorts of sights and scenery and actions that to us don't necessarily scan with the same effectiveness as they would have in the 1930s. But the thing you need to keep in mind is that in 1931, sound being a relatively recent medium, and silent pictures still going strong, and with silent movies where musical scoring, even if it wasn't original, was almost omnipresent throughout the movie, to go into a movie that's 85 minutes long and for there to be no non-diegetic music, for there to be no original film score, this was quite different than what anybody was expecting. And as a result, you have this very unique film in which the audience does not have music that is sort of instructing them or sort of coaxing them emotionally. They're really just put into this dark place that is unfamiliar and gothic and eerie, and they don't really have anything that is sort of alleviating that sense. There's nothing that, there's no stirring strings, there's no, when the heroes are about to, face off with Dracula, there's no triumphalist score. Everything is done very much in this kind of matter-of-fact way. And it sort of becomes this thing where you can understand from a certain perspective, given the culture of film music at the time, how that would have been particularly disturbing to a spectator, to not have music, to just basically be alone in a dark theater and only hear sound effects and only hear ambience, whether it's the scurrying of a rat or a bat at the window or
Hal the wolf.
Right, exactly, And I think that's true, and that's the thing that is sort of, the thing is that, like, I can appreciate certain aspects of Dracula, but the thing to understand is that it is very much a very rough movie in which this is the first time anybody is really doing something like this, and the rules really aren't written yet. And so there are certain things I can appreciate about it, but then there are other things about it that, like, I feel are just genuinely kind of lazy. And really it just comes down to the directing side of it. The movie is directed by a guy named Todd Browning. Now, Todd Browning, before this point, he worked briefly at Universal, but he was more famous for working at MGM, and he had particularly made a string of movies starring Lon Chaney. And Lon Chaney obviously being the notorious Man of a Thousand Faces, a very beloved actor who was notorious for spending an incredible amount of time working on the makeup for his roles and the costumes for his roles and really embodying very unusual characters. And so Todd Browning is a guy who is coming from this tradition of who already makes a lot of movies that are in the realm of the weird and the unusual and even the horrific. So some movies he directed were London After Midnight, which is now lost, which is a kind...
Goodness gracious, really? Oh, it's really been lost?
Yeah. The only thing that survives from London After Midnight are a series of stills and production photographs.
That's Lon Chaney, right?
Yeah, Lon Chaney. He plays a dual role in the film as a detective and as a false villain who puts on airs that he might be some kind of vampire. So there's the interesting Dracula connection there. But he also made West of Zanzibar with Lon Chaney, and that's a very eerie movie in which he plays a crippled man who... a crippled magician who uses magic tricks to kind of enthrall a bunch of East African natives in order to take revenge on the man who cuckolded him, years before. So, like, he wasn't, like, Todd Browning was not unused to dark movies and to the eerie and to elements of the horrific. And so really you couldn't pick a better person to do Dracula, to say, now there are no rules. Now you can just make a movie where the horrific is real and it's relevant and it's present and it's there. But the problem is, and what's weird is that if you look at Todd Browning's surviving silent films, there is far more variety in terms of shot composition, and there's a far more lively rhythm to the editing than there is in Dracula. And I think that's a really big issue with the film, is that Dracula just... it's an almost kind of ascetic movie. Where
right. I understand what you're saying. Like filming a fence for an hour. And then
yeah, it's like...
right, like I forget the guy who filmed one fence for a whole sequence, and he called it Life, where he just films a fence. Oh, My Life, and that's it. It's one of the... he died recently. I forget the name of the actual film, but I understand what you're saying. It has an aesthetic quality to it, just its deliberateness, right? And it's not...
and some people have proposed, some historians have proposed that it might just have been because he wasn't used to sound technology, but I think it might even have been because he was working with sound. I think what it comes down to is that he wanted to make something that was the complete... I think what happened was Todd Browning realized that he was dealing with very weird subject matter. and something that, unlike the movies he had made before, there was no rational explanation for it. And so I think realizing that he was doing something that had never been done before, he decided, well, then I'm going to do it in a way that has never been done before. Like, during the filming process, he cut down on a lot of materials. Like, the screenplay was written by Garrett Fort, and as he was directing the film, Todd Browning actually cut down on the number of shots that were specified in the shooting draft, particularly more ostentatious ones that took in the sets or on close-ups. He really aimed to make it as a sort of plain and minimalist even as possible in terms of what he was depicting. And then I think also he decides that he's going to do the opposite of what he would do in a silent film, which is rather than doing the thing where in the medium where so much of it is music, in the sound film, go the alternate route where there's no music, where you are simply in the kind of eerie space of something that is like our reality but not really reality. And so there's pluses to that because it is a very weird film, even like right down to the line readings of the actors. It's not just that they're theatrical, especially with the actress who plays Mina and the actress who plays Lucy. There's this they have a kind of atypical delivery. There's something about the performances too, which is just not conventional.
Laugh all you like. I think he's fascinating.
Oh, I suppose he's all right. But give me someone a little more normal.
Like John?
Yes, dear. Like John.
Castle. Dracula. Transylvania.
Well, Countess.
No, it's almost as if they're deliberately trying to fill time. So they're after, even at the end of their sentences, their facial expressions hang on to the emotion that they're expressing for a relatively long period of time, and the camera's focusing on them. So clearly, it appear to be like maybe what you said is absolutely true, a mismatch between the direction and also, I think, on the other hand, the guy who was filming, or the person that was filming, lacked the ability to know when, or well, whoever did the editing then should have edited at some point. But I agree with what you're saying, that their delivery is not stilted, but kind of different. Like it's meant to fill a void that isn't necessarily you would have to do. You just have to,
There's lots of,
but there's a lot of positive elements to that, isn't
yeah.
there? I mean,
but that's the thing is that like you can appreciate it in the sense like there's lots of pregnant pauses in
Yes.
the dialogue, just
Yes.
lots of hanging air.
right. Even by pouring the wine at 1/10 of a second per frame,
Yeah, and obviously Bela Lugosi gives like a fantastic performance in the movie. And that's the thing is like Bela Lugosi often gets a bad rap as kind of like an over actor. But if you're really, I think, really understanding Dracula is that he and Dwight Fry, who plays Renfield, the man who goes to sell him Carfax Abbey, the house in England, and then is turned into his kind of mad slave, their acting in the movie is particularly good, but it sort of centralizes the kind of ethos of all the performances, where it's just not realist. And in fact, it's almost as if it's like they're deliberately unearthly, which makes sense because Dracula is an unearthly figure. He is a 500-year-old undead count. He wouldn't act the way that a regular person would. He wouldn't act as if he, was a regular person.
it's almost as if they're in a different dimension,
Yeah.
and that Dracula dictates that dimension. And so they're all like frozen, like many movies where you slow down time or you slow down the people in time. They all seem to be caught up in the mystique of him. It may be by accident. I don't know if it was deliberate. That's why. So you can talk about that. But it seems like why if you're directing a film, it's hard to believe, and also you're focusing, and a lot of times they wanted to zoom in on the face. So who's the guy that plays Renfield again?
Dwight Fry.
I mean, he has the facial expression which hangs on for quite a bit of time, and then there's some doubt that comes over him because he's still looking at Dracula with fear, or at least with it's kind of intrepidation. But then it goes back into reality of saying, I have the deeds right here for the Abbey, and I have enough passes for your luggage. He says, I just need 3.
Yeah.
And but it's really cool because I think you're right. But there's something about hanging on each word. I mean, there's something to that where the words sort of like, I don't know. It seems like that they're maybe that takes the place of the music. Maybe the fact that the drawn out lines, take the place of the music, and it holds on to the drama, sort of like stretching hot taffy, in a way. It's just,
right.
But it does something. You're right. It takes the whole thing, and in an unreal world, stretches it as if you see, like if you're in a type of trance or something. Has a trance-like quality to it.
I am Dracula.
Oh, it's really good to see you. I don't know what happened to the driver and my luggage, and with all this, I thought I was in the wrong place.
I bid you welcome.
And that carries out throughout. There are a couple of places, and that's where it seems more awkward when it breaks from that. That seems right. Then it seems a little jarring. All of a sudden, it's like, it seems like it's not appropriate. But once he's in a room, then it all seems to slow down once again to, a deliberate.
Yeah, I think it's definitely like, I think the first 30 minutes or so of the film, when it's mostly just built around Bela Lugosi and Dwight Fry, where it's, Renfield goes to Transylvania, he meets Dracula makes him his slave, then he takes the ship back to England. These are the best parts of the movie, I think, not only because of just the sets of the Transylvania sets, and especially Dracula's glorious castle, which you were looking at this castle set and you were saying, I can't even tell where the set ends and the matte painting begins, and I was just like, that's not a matte painting. This is a huge interior set that is all done just for this one sequence. Which is, and it pays off because this is crucial. This is the moment where we see Dracula in his element. And all of those scenes are the most sort of obvious. And they're the most sort of obvious in terms of, I think, their effectiveness in terms of atmosphere. But then you get to the more crucial part. And this is the thing about Dracula, is that, the original Bram Stoker novel, Dracula really isn't a present figure. He spends a lot of time in the margins. It's very seldom that people interact with him directly. And when people do interact with him directly, he's not characterized as someone who's conventionally handsome or charming. In fact, it's the opposite. He evinces something diabolical about him. The power he has over people is purely kind of satanic and unearthly. There's no charm or effete sort of dignity to him. He's an undead figure, and he spends most of the time off screen. What the crucial thing about the Hamilton Dean play, and the thing that this movie borrows the most from it, is the concept of Dracula being someone who could move seamlessly through the real world, someone who could look for all intents and purposes, like a gentleman, who you would see at your door and you would invite him into your house and you would serve him your wine. He would decline, but someone who could be in your salon and talk to you and have all the same conversations about, the philosophies of the day and the literature of the day and the issues of the times. And so that's what you see. And that's the thing that I think is often neglected about the later half of the movie, where that's all that it is, which is that, Dracula has now invaded and intruded into this proper English upper crust society. And that's the thing, is that, like, you know, it's like, it's, if you don't know that about Dracula, if you don't know how unique this presentation of it is and how different it is from Bram Stoker's novel, it's a bit subtle of, like, what is going on here. Like, you know, and that's the thing where it comes down to, it's like, you need to really take seriously the idea of Dracula as a kind of imposter. And I think the really fantastic scene that makes it pay off is precisely the scene where Van Helsing is looking at the mirror in the cigarette box, and he sees that Dracula casts no reflection. And one of the best...
By the way, that's one of the best parts of the film.
Oh, absolutely. And
because he does it a couple of times, and, you know, and then he tries to get... No, I can't. It wasn't... Okay, go ahead.
I think and this is the thing, I think this is a perfect example of what the movie does really well and what it doesn't do well. Because everything that is good about this scene is a function of the performance and not necessarily the direction. And I think, like, there's some aspects of the direction that work, but once you know, because this is a point at which Todd Browning can't do just the sort of theatrical master shot thing. He needs to do something a little cinematic in order to show you that Dracula isn't reflected in the mirror. Now, in the original Hamilton Dean play, the way that it was done was basically just through it was not just a cigarette box, it was a whole mirror along the wall that, you know, and through some reflective trickery, Van Helsing is looking in the mirror and he sees that Lucy Mina is dancing with Dracula, but Dracula casts no reflection. But in the movie, it's a cigarette box, which is kind of a cool cinematic trick because it gives you something that we don't get a lot of in the movie, which is visual variety, which is, you know, it's not necessarily crucial to horror, but it's crucial just to basic sort of film entertainment. It's crucial to give something for the audience that breaks up and gives a rhythm to the action, so that because of course the movie isn't a play. The atmosphere of watching a movie isn't the same as watching a play. But so what you have is that he sees, you know, Van Helsing sees that Dracula casts no reflection, and there's this wonderful thing where, you know, this sort of tete-a-tete between Van Helsing and Dracula, where Van Helsing knows that Dracula is an imposter, and from the minute Dracula arrives, evinces such contempt for him. In a way that is sort of thematic in a way, because it's not just that he has contempt for him because he's a monster. It's almost like he has contempt for him as like an imposter, as someone who just doesn't deserve to be there, who isn't the gentleman he claims to be. There's something...
Right, but doesn't Dracula recognize him from Van Helsing in Europe? Doesn't he recognize him as being a student of vampirism?
Yeah, and that may be an element of it. But that's the thing, is that, like, and again, it's very subtle, but you notice it enough that, like, you know, Bela Lugosi is treading the line between, I don't know how much this guy knows, but I know that he's, unlike the rest of these people, he's actually smart. Like, and that's the thing that Dracula gets away with. Dracula doesn't necessarily just get away with having magic powers. He gets away with the fact that most people are just kind of thoughtless and just inviting people into their homes just on, like, spurious claims of, like, I am from Transylvania, I am a count, I am a rich man, so of course we should share wine together, and of course you should introduce me to your daughter. Yes, I have no nefarious, you know, plans. But then it all coalesces in Van Helsing offering him the cigarette. And as soon as Bela Lugosi looks down and sees the mirror, just smashing it out of his hand. And then again, a great bit of finally some visual variety where the camera just tracks in ever so much on Bela Lugosi. And for the first time, you see Dracula, like, offended. He's not even scared because he knows he's been caught, but he's just like, how fucking dare you? You know, like...
Right, and how rapid that is. It's almost instantaneous. As soon as it's almost instantaneous.
The gentleman is gone. All that's left is the beast.
Right.
The wolf, as it were.
So
And
yeah.
of course, the characters say as much. It's like he just went wild for a second. Like, I've never seen him do that. It's like a proper gentleman wouldn't act in such a way.
but he apologizes.
Yes, he does. And that's the thing is that, like, and I guess you can tell.
Van Helsing didn't tell you I don't like mirrors.
Yeah.
So he already knows they're onto him.
Yeah. And that's the great thing is that, like, it's like the movie really is at its best when it's the kind of tete-a-tete between Edward Van Sloan and Bela Lugosi, between Van Helsing and Dracula. And it's also those moments where you finally see Todd Browning trying some visual variety that gives the movie where it gives the movie rhythm. It gives the movie a kind of clipping, even though there's not a lot of action in the movie, it feels like there's action. It feels like something is like really going on a dramatic level. I think the failing of Dracula, if anything, again, with the caveat that this was the first horror movie, nobody had ever done anything like this. Everyone, the Carl Laemmle Jr.'s father was like, not even on board with it. Like, like a lot of people were just telling them, no. There was a lot of disorganization at the studio. I think as the first horror movie, I think the failure of it does come down to the fact that I think Todd Browning is just a little bit too self-assured with how weird and unusual the concept of vampirism is, that he doesn't explore as many avenues as he can cinematically in order to make it compelling. So little things about it can work. Little things like, I especially think of the scene where the cop shows up outside of the graveyard on his little bicycle at night outside of the graveyard, and he hears a child crying. And in fact, that's all you hear is just a child crying. And then rather than another establishing shot of the cop picking up the child or something, it just cuts to Lucy, who has recently died, all dressed in white, just walking in a trance through the forest. And then we cut to a newspaper headline that says, 2 children report being attacked by a strange woman. Mm-hmm. I think that's a fantastic demonstration of and this is distilled horror, because I think the difference is it's the difference between being scared by anticipation of something, which is sort of just terror, whereas horror is just the sort of the sort of
blood curdling,
just the suggestion of what we've seen.
They're feeding on children,
and of course, like this is the perfect demonstration of what Browning is going for. This is why you don't have music, and this is why you have less shots, because hearing that child crying and seeing it in such a removed way, of the policeman just showing up in this dark place and not having any closure about what happened except in this totally abstracted way, it's very effective. Yeah. It's, even nowadays it's still effective. But I think for the most part, Browning is just, and part of it is just because, I think the it's just like it all kind of, even by the end of the movie, it's just sort of like it goes up in a puff of smoke.
Yes, right. It's almost as if they were anxious to get it finished or something.
Well, they were absolutely anxious to get it finished. They were trying to get it out by the beginning of hopefully by the end of the year, but then by the end of next year. Like, I think it did go somewhat over budget and over schedule. Like, it was they shot for like 1 sec. I'm trying to figure out see my notes here.
Yeah, just to touch on the basis about the blood curdliness of hearing a child, and the effectiveness of not having to show anything about it and just having the headline read. Remember, the most disturbing scene I've ever seen, I knew I didn't want to see it, is Under the Skin, where the kid's abandoned on the water.
Yeah, I
did not need to see that, and I think that's different. It's a different kind of horror. It's not horror. It's just it's frustration, and it's an anxiety. It's like it gets to. So it's a little different. It's kind of interesting.
But you still see how these same rules still work, where just the ambient texture of a scene can do so much, because it's not just the sight of the child crying, it's also just the oppressive sound of the tide.
Right.
Because you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
You don't know if the tide is just going to sweep in and take the child or something.
Right.
Like, all of these things are open. And so that's the thing, is that, like, when we're talking about Dracula, it's an incredibly rough and disorganized movie, but we can already see really critical elements of what makes something horror besides just content, of the stylistic decisions that you can use to really get under someone's skin.
It works better than some of the visuals of other Dracula films where you actually see a sack with children in it crying, and you see the thing flopping around. It's not quite the same as the effectiveness in the Dracula is much better than having the visual of that. I think both in Bram Stoker's Dracula and even in one of the Hammer films, I think there's a scene involving children in the sack or something to feed the wives. He brings them back to feed the wives, right, or whatever you call them. But you're right. Yes.
It's sort of the eternal dialogue in horror, where it's just like, it's like, what is too much? Like,
Right.
Is it better to rely on suggestion, or is it better to just show the thing? It's like, and at a certain point, and this is the thing, is that, like, it's really kind of a false dichotomy, because at the end of the day, what Todd Browning is critically lacking here is just some visual variety, is just some way of making the audience.
Yes, a lot of thought must have gone into it, don't you think? To get it that crisp and cut, to get the effectiveness of the child. It probably comes out of Stoker, right? I would imagine. It must be in the actual novel.
I forget. Like, I haven't read it in a long time.
I'm just wondering why it seems it's clipped, it's quick, and you just pan into the picture of you pan into the news article, right?
Dissolved in the news article.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you dissolved? Was that a dissolve? Okay. Anyway.
But yeah, like, and I think, and that's the thing, is like, so Dracula comes out, it's a monster hit. It is, and this is the interesting thing. And this is why, it's important to think of Dracula as the first horror movie. Because when the publicity department for Universal is trying to think of how to sell Dracula, well, no one knew how to sell it. Because
a love story?
No, exactly. That's exactly what they thought. They thought, no one has ever made a horror movie before, so we don't know how to sell a horror movie. So how do we sell it? So early publicity for Dracula, it didn't emphasize the monster. It didn't emphasize blood drinking. It emphasized Bela Lugosi preying on women. It emphasized, quote, the strange passion of this creature. And so, like, and that's the other thing about, like, the sort of the censor, where the censors get involved, where, like, like, Carl Laemmle had been interested in adapting Dracula before even the play was a hit. But when he gave the novel to the story department in order to judge whether it was possible to make a movie out of it, they, almost uniformly, his, people were just like, the censors will never let you get away with this, because it is, despite everything, there is clearly a sexual element to this. There is clearly this element of, Dracula particularly preying on women. And you see that demonstrated very much in the movie, where there's a girl selling tulips on the street, and Dracula just kind of walks up to her, and and he looks like he's about to kiss her and to ravish her, but then of course he actually is drinking her blood. But like, it's a paper thin metaphor here. But like, and that's the thing, is that so the movie gets released, they don't know quite how to sell it, so they sort of sell it on the basis of it kind of being romantic, a little bit eerie, but like slowly, for most of it, they realize that, number one, Bela Lugosi becomes hugely popular, especially among women. Like, and that's the thing, it's the weird sort of, like, because this had already happened when he played Dracula on the stage, is that, and he would talk about this in later interviews, is that, like, women developed a very strange passion for him, but only as the vampire. They didn't care about him. They didn't want to know. They wanted to live this fantasy that Dracula was real, because despite the fact that the play is about women being ravished by a horrible undead monster, the reality is that many people, you know, especially in these very repressive times, you know, they have like a lot of pent up, you know, sense of alienation and lack of satisfaction. So
like, what is it? It's the depression, right?
Well, yeah, the Great Depression probably had something to do with it, but I think in general it just comes...
Usually musicals were the remedy, right, for the depression. But here, this is a horror film, right?
Yeah, and it made, you know, tons of money.
And nickel pop, 10 cents?
Yeah. And so that movie comes out, and so once people at Universal see that, okay, so this isn't just the actor. There is a market for this kind of movie.
Genre, right.
This kind of genre.
Right.
And so immediately they're like, all right, we need another one of these and we need it fast. Now, because Universal is still so disorganized at the time, they're not going to get another movie actually in theaters. So Dracula comes out in February. Their next horror movie doesn't come out until November. But it's the logical step. It's like, okay, so we adapted Dracula. What's another novel that we can adapt? And hopefully one that has already been adapted into a play, so it's not as hard to adapt a full novel into a finished screenplay. And so the next one comes, there's a novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was recently adapted by a lady named Peggy Wembling, which was also toured by Hamilton Dean in London. And so they say, all right, we're going to buy the rights to this play. We're going to adapt Frankenstein next.
I'm worried about Henry. Why has he left the university? He was doing so well, and he seemed so happy with his work.
Well, you know, his research is in the field of chemical galvanism and electrobiology. We're far in advance of our theories here at the university. In fact, they had reached a most advanced stage. They were becoming dangerous.
That's going to do it for the first episode of our second season of Monster Craze Memoirs. Keep your ear to the ground for more supplemental materials as they come down the pipeline, and join us same time next week as Rocco and I return to discuss Universal's second horror film from 1931, James Whale's Frankenstein. Till then, good night, sleep tight, and don't let the vampires bite.